Theodore Marsh had been sitting at table 7 for 22 minutes when he finally accepted that she wasn't coming. He didn't move right away. That wasn't his nature. He sat with his hands folded around a glass of water he hadn't touched, watching the front door of Carver's Grill, the way a man watches a storm he's already decided to wait out. The restaurant was warm and low-lit, the kind of place that made loneliness feel more dignified than it deserved to be. Christmas music played somewhere in the back, soft enough that you could almost forget it was there. His daughter had set this up. That was the part that made him stay as long as he did. Not hope, exactly, but the thought of having to call Becca later and explain that he'd left after 15 minutes. Becca had spent 3 weeks convincing him that this was a good idea, that a blind date at 58 wasn't something to be ashamed of, that Margaret had been gone for 4 years now, and that wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't forever. So Theodore had put on the blue shirt that Becca said made him look like he was trying, which he supposed was the point. He'd driven his 2009 Silverado to the restaurant because he'd forgotten to ask Becca if he should drive something nicer, and then remembered halfway there that he didn't own anything nicer. He'd arrived 7 minutes early and ordered water and sat at table 7 and waited. The woman who sat down across from him at 7:14 had introduced herself as Gail. She was pleasant. She had a nervous laugh and asked him 3 times what he did for work, and each time he said he managed a small land operation outside of Dunmore. She'd nodded politely in the way people nod when they're not sure what that means but don't want to ask. They had talked for 9 minutes. Then Gail had excused herself to use the restroom, and the server had come by with a folded note on a cocktail napkin that said simply, "I'm so sorry." She went out the side door. I didn't know what else to do. Theodore had read the note twice, refolded it, and set it under his water glass. That had been 22 minutes ago. He was thinking about Margaret, not in the sharp way, not the way that used to ambush him at the grocery store or in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon for no reason at all. This was quieter. He was thinking about the way she used to say that he was the least embarrassable person she'd ever met, and how she meant it as a compliment, and how he'd taken it as one. She would have found this funny. The blind date, the note, the sitting alone at table 7, ordering nothing, while the busboy kept refilling his water out of either professionalism or pity. She would have laughed until she had to put her hand on his arm to steady herself, and then she would have told him to go home. He was reaching for his coat when the front door opened, and a woman came in with snow in her hair. She stood in the entrance, scanning the room, and Theodore watched her the way he watched most things, quietly, without any particular expectation. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in a dark green coat that was doing its best against the weather outside. One of her boots had a faint scuff across the toe. She was carrying a small gift deep bag by its handle, the tissue paper inside pushed flat from the wind, and she was visibly out of breath in the way of someone who had been running. Her eyes found him. She crossed the restaurant without stopping and sat down in the chair across from him and set the gift bag on the table and said, "You're Theodore Marsh, it was not a question." "I am," he said. "I'm Vivian." She was still catching her breath. "Vivian Cole, I'm your date. I'm so sorry, I know how this looks. I know you've been sitting here, I just..." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. There was a car off the road on Highway 9 about 4 miles back. A young woman. She'd gone into the ditch in the snow and her phone was dead. And there was no one else around, and I couldn't just. She shook her head. I couldn't keep driving. So I stopped, and I waited with her until the tow truck came, and the whole time I'm thinking, there is a man sitting at a restaurant table who is going to think I am the worst person alive. Theodore looked at her for a moment. "Is she all right?" he said. "The woman in the ditch." Vivian blinked. "Yes, she's fine. Her brother was in the tow truck." "Good," he said. He picked up the menu the server had left an hour ago. "Have you eaten?" She ordered the chicken. He ordered the same thing he'd been planning to order before any of this happened, which was the pot roast, because he didn't believe in changing your order just because the circumstances of the evening had shifted. Vivian watched him order with an expression he couldn't quite read, and then she looked around the restaurant like she was still half expecting something else to go wrong. "I almost didn't stop," she said after a while. "I want you to be honest with me. If I hadn't stopped and I'd just gotten here on time, would that have been the worst thing?" "No," Theodore said. "But you would have known." She looked at him. What does that mean? It means you'd have been sitting here thinking about her the whole time, he said. Whether she was okay, whether somebody stopped. You'd have been here in body and somewhere else entirely in your head. Vivian was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific thing to say to someone you met 4 minutes ago. I've been told I skip ahead, he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, short and a little surprised, the kind that comes out before you've decided whether something is actually funny. Theodore noted it the way he noted most things, filed it somewhere useful without making a show of it. They talked through dinner in the way of two people who have both independently decided that small talk is a tax they'd rather not pay. He learned that Vivian Cole had grown up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had spent 15 years as a pediatric occupational therapist in Columbus before moving to the Dunmore area 18 months ago to be closer to her daughter. He learned that her daughter's name was Lily, that Lily was 9 years old, and that Lily had been managing a congenital heart condition since she was 2. He learned that Vivian had spent the last 8 years doing the quiet, exhausting arithmetic of a mother who was always one phone call away from a different life. In return, Theodore told her about the land operation, which was not, as Gail had perhaps imagined, a modest hobby farm, but was in fact a timber and conservation trust running across roughly 11,000 acres of the Dunmore Valley, which his grandfather had started and his father had grown, and which Theodore had spent the last 30 years stewarding with such low-key dedication that most people in town thought he was a retired handyman. He didn't say the part about the 11,000 acres. He said he managed a land operation outside of town. It was true. It was also, as Margaret used to tell him, the most spectacular undersell in the history of the English language. What he did say was that he had a daughter named Becca, that Becca had set up this evening, and that Becca was currently at this very moment waiting for a phone call to find out whether her father was a disaster. Vivian smiled. What are you going to tell her? Depends on how the rest of the evening goes, he said. It went well. That was the honest answer, and Theodore was a man who defaulted to honesty the way some people default to politeness. Not because it was always easier, but because it was the only posture he knew how to hold for long. The dinner went well. They closed the restaurant without meaning to, sitting there while the servers turned chairs upside down on the surrounding tables, and the Christmas music cycled through its third rotation. He paid the check. Vivian argued briefly, and then stopped arguing, which he suspected was not something she did often. Outside, the snow had thinned to something half-hearted. The parking lot was mostly empty. Their cars, it turned out, were parked 2 spots apart, which felt like the kind of detail that belonged in a story someone told later. The gift bag, Theodore said before she could get in. You brought a gift bag. Vivian looked down at the bag still in her hand, then laughed the way people laugh at themselves. I didn't know what you brought to a blind date. I Googled it. Someone said a small gesture was thoughtful. I bought a candle. A candle? It's cedar and pine. It smells like the outdoors. I thought maybe you'd like it given. She gestured vaguely, presumably at the outdoors in general. He accepted the candle. He turned it over once and looked at it and said, "Thank you," and meant it without ceremony the way he meant most things. She gave him her number before she got in her car. He waited until she'd pulled out of the lot before he drove home. That night he set the candle on the windowsill of the kitchen and didn't light it. He wasn't ready for that yet, but he left it where he could see it. He called her 3 days later. Not 2, because 2 felt like he'd been watching the clock, and not 4, because 4 felt like he was pretending not to. 3 was honest. They met for coffee on a Saturday morning at a place she chose, a small shop on Birch Street that had mismatched chairs and exposed brick and a chalkboard menu that changed every week. He arrived first. She arrived 7 minutes after, snow in her hair again. It was becoming, he thought, a pattern, and sat down across from him and said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about stopping for the woman in the ditch." "What about it?" he said. "I've been thinking that you were right," she said. "And I've also been thinking that it's strange you understood that so immediately. Most people would have said they wished I'd just come on time." "Most people would have been thinking about their own evening," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "What were you thinking about?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I was thinking about my wife," he said. "She passed 4 years ago, and I was thinking that she would have told me to go home." Vivian was quiet. Not in the uncomfortable way, not looking for a redirect or a change of subject. Quiet in the way of someone who understood that not everything needed to be filled in. "I lost someone too," she said after a while. "Lily's father. Not to death. He left when Lily was 3, after the second surgery. Said he couldn't do it." She paused. "Some losses don't come with casseroles and condolence cards, but they're still losses." "They are," Theodore said. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a car went by slowly on the snowy street. "Her next cardiology appointment is in February," Vivian said. "I always get." She stopped, started over. "I always get quiet the week before. I want to warn you in case we're still talking by February." He registered the in case. He filed it somewhere. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. They were still talking by February. The cardiology appointment was on the 14th, which was Valentine's Day. A coincidence that Vivian made exactly one dry joke about and then set aside. He did not send flowers that morning. He did not want her to have to explain a vase of roses in the waiting room. What he did instead was leave a voicemail on her phone at 7 in the morning, just to say he was thinking of her, that he hoped the roads were clear, that he'd be around all day if she needed anything. He kept it short. She called him from the parking garage afterward. He picked up on the second ring. "Good numbers," she said. Her voice was thin with relief. "Really good. Dr. Faulkner said Lily's doing better than the projections." Theodore was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the field when she said it. The snow was still heavy on the fence posts. He let out a breath he hadn't consciously been holding. "Good," he said. "You sound relieved. I am relieved." A pause. "Theodore, Vivian, don't let me forget to thank Becca," she said, "for setting this up." He smiled at the window. "I'll pass it along." It was somewhere in those months, the coffee on Birch Street, the February call, the Sunday afternoons, where he would drive to her apartment, and they would sit at her kitchen table with the good light coming in from the east window. That Theodore understood something he hadn't quite been prepared for. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, to find the whole enterprise more difficult. The dating, the disclosure, the slow work of letting someone new into the specific geography of who he was. He had expected it to feel like starting over. It didn't feel like starting over. It felt like something quieter than that. Like a door he'd thought was closed had turned out to be only latched. He hadn't said any of this to Vivian, not because he was guarded. He was somewhat, by nature, but because he didn't believe in saying things before they had earned their full weight. Margaret had always said he was the kind of man who let his actions speak first and used words only to confirm what was already understood. She'd meant it affectionately. He hoped Vivian was starting to understand it the same way. He met Lily for the first time on a Sunday in March. Vivian had not rushed it. He'd appreciated that. She'd been careful in the way of a woman who had learned, by hard experience, the difference between introducing her daughter to someone and exposing her daughter to something uncertain. He'd watched her navigate that line without calling attention to it, which he thought took a particular kind of intelligence. Lily Cole was 9 years old, thin-wristed, and serious in the way of children who have spent time in hospitals and learned that adults don't always mean what they say. She had her mother's eyes and a way of studying people from a slight distance before she decided what to do with them. She shook Theodore's hand. He shook it back, seriously, as though she were a colleague. She looked at his truck in the driveway and said, "That's really old." 2009, he said. "Good truck, though. My grandpa has a newer one. Good for your grandpa," he said. She considered this. Considered him. Then she went inside to get her coat because Vivian had promised her hot chocolate at the shop on Birch Street, and that was apparently a more pressing matter than further assessment of the truck. Vivian appeared in the doorway behind where Lily had been standing, and Theodore caught her expression, that fraction of relief she hadn't quite smoothed away in time. He pretended not to notice. He was good at that. At the hot chocolate shop, Lily sat across from him and asked him 17 questions in the span of 40 minutes. He answered all of them. What kind of trees were on his land, whether he'd ever seen a bear, what happened to old trees when they fell, whether his daughter was nice, whether his wife had been nice. He paused on that last one. "She was," he said. "She was very nice. She would have liked you, I think. She liked people who asked questions." Lily absorbed this without sentiment. "I ask a lot of questions because my mom says if you don't ask, you just make stuff up." "Your mom's right," he said. Vivian was looking at him over the rim of her mug. He didn't look back at her right away. He didn't need to. Spring came the way springs come in that part of Pennsylvania. Slow, then suddenly like someone had finally made a decision. The ice went out of the creek on the eastern edge of the land in the first week of April. Theodore walked the fence line on a Saturday morning and thought about what Vivian had said the week before, when they'd been sitting on the porch of his house for the first time. She'd stood at the railing looking out at the field and the tree line beyond it, and she'd said quietly, "How much land do you have?" "Some," he'd said. She'd looked at him sideways. "Theodore, 11,000 acres, give or take." The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone recalibrating. "You told me you managed a land operation," she said. "I do. You didn't mention 11,000 acres. You didn't ask." She'd turned to face him then, and she wasn't angry, exactly, but she was something. She was looking at him the way people looked at optical illusions when the image had finally shifted. Like the picture was the same, but everything she'd understood about it had rearranged. "Is there anything else I should know?" she said. He thought about it. "I own the building that Carver's Grill is in," he said. "I've owned it for 14 years. I didn't want to mention it on the first date because it seemed like showing off." Another silence. "The restaurant where we met," she said. "Yes." She'd laughed then, long and a little helpless, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere past the point where a person has decided to find something funny. He'd let her laugh. He'd watched the field and let her work through it. "Becca knew," she said, when she'd settled. "When she set this up, Becca knows everything," he said. "She gets that from her mother." Walking the fence line in April, he thought about that afternoon. He thought about the way Vivian had eventually leaned on the railing beside him and said, "For what it's worth, I liked you better when I thought you were just a quiet man with an old truck." And the way he'd said, "I'm still both of those things." He'd meant it. Lily started calling him Mr. Marsh, which was formal but which he suspected, given what he knew of her, meant she had decided he was real, not a visitor, not an experiment, real. In May, she asked him if the trees on his land had names. He said some of them did. There was an old white oak on the south ridge that his father had called the alderman, because it was the largest one on the property and stood alone at the top of the hill overlooking everything else. His grandfather had called it something different, but that name had been lost. "Can I name one?" Lily asked. "You'd have to earn it," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "How? Come see it first, then decide." The following Saturday, Vivian drove Lily out to the property and Theodore walked them up the south ridge. It was a long walk for Lily, and they took it slowly. He didn't make a thing of the slowness. He just adjusted his pace and pointed out things along the way the creek bent at the bottom, the kind of moss that grew on north-facing rocks, a pair of red-tailed hawks circling high above the eastern tree line. Lily watched everything. She asked questions. When they got to the top of the ridge, she stood in front of the white oak and looked up at it for a long time without saying anything. "Well," Theodore said. "Harriet," she said. "Why Harriet?" She shrugged. "She looks like a Harriet." He looked at the tree. He looked at Lily. "Harriet it is," he said. He did not look at Vivian. He didn't need to. He could feel the quality of her silence, which had shifted the way a room's atmosphere shifts when something true has just been said. On the walk down, Lily reached up and took his hand because the slope was steep and she needed steadying. He held her hand and steadied her and said nothing about it. And she said nothing about it, and that was how it was. He asked Vivian to marry him on a Tuesday in June, not because it was romantic per se to do it on a Tuesday, but because by the time he'd decided to ask, there had been nothing particularly eventful about the day, and he had come to believe that the best things in a life tended to arrive on ordinary days, and should not have to wait for circumstances to be interesting enough. They were in her kitchen. She was making pasta. He was sitting at the table with a coffee he'd stopped drinking because it had gone cold, watching her work. The evening light was coming in from the east window in the particular way it did in June, long and golden and unhurried. He said her name. She turned from the stove. He didn't get down on one knee because the kitchen was small, and there were shoes near his chair, and it would have been awkward, and he thought Vivian deserved a proposal that was honest rather than theatrical. He looked at her from his chair and said, "I'd like to marry you, if that's something you want." Vivian set down the wooden spoon. She leaned back against the counter and looked at him for a long moment with the expression he'd come to understand was her most serious one, Not doubt, but the face she made when she was giving something its full weight. "Lily," she said. "I know," he said. I know what she needs," he said. "I've been paying attention." The pasta was boiling quietly behind her. The evening light lay across the floor between them. "You didn't bring a ring," she said. "I thought you might want to pick it out," he said. "You have opinions about things." She laughed. It broke something open in the room, that laugh. The way it always did, short and surprised and real. And then the longer part after it settled. She pressed her hand over her eyes for a moment, then dropped it. "Yes," she said. "Yes to the ring, or yes to all of it," she said. "Yes to you." He nodded. He stood up from the chair and crossed the small kitchen, and she met him halfway, and they stood there in the east light with the pasta still going and the wooden spoon on the counter, and he held her the way he did most things, quietly, without performance, like he intended to stay. She pulled back after a while and looked at him. "We have to tell Lily," she said. "I know," he said. "She's going to ask you 100 questions. I know that too." Vivian smiled. The full one. The one that started in her eyes before it got anywhere else. "You ready for that?" Theodore thought about the ridge, about Harriet the oak tree, about a small hand in his on a steep slope holding on. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am."